stretch us, make us think and see how we can reach outwards and listen to people from outside. So that's it. I'm not going to waffle on much more, but just to say a couple of things. One is that Greg, who's there, is managing the conversations and the things. He's like the underlying technical person. And he has, if anybody wants to say anything, just type in chat onto the messages, onto the chat room, and he will know that you want to say something, and he will alert the panel or make a decision, you know, one way or another, alert Sonia in particular. Sonia is the person who's chairing it, and we're ever so pleased to have Sonia here. I put up Sonia's biography, but she's got a long history of activism in Derby, including helping run the Mandela Center in Derby, and also she's involved in Black Lives Matter. So she'll be chairing it, and I'll be handing over to her in a minute. We've asked people to put up anything about themselves. This will all be published, if you don't mind. And if you want to be added to War on Want's email list, say so, and I'll pass your details into War on Want without you necessarily having to go public with your email list. So let's go. We're aiming to finish about 20 past 8 o'clock. Slightly elastic. We'll finish with the announcements. After we've had we're going to have 10 minutes for Michael, Dr. Michael from the United States talking. Then we're going to have Asad talking. Then the aim is to go through 7 questions which have been posted. Some of those questions, some of you might answer it between Greg and Sonia. I suggest you go through those questions, but you might feel already that we've already covered it one way or another. Then we'll open it up, and I'm asking in particular people from overseas to enrich us with your experiences. And we'll ask the main speakers to come in how and when they want to. It's up to you, Sonia, and up to the speakers just to shout, cry, swear, whatever you want to do. So I'd like, with that, on the note of swearing, I'd like to pass over to Sonia, but once again, say thank you ever so much for everybody for coming. I'm really looking forward to this. Bye-bye.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's lovely to be here in your company. Just quickly like to say thank you to Derbyshire Climate Coalition for organising this, and particularly important because we're including the Global South in the conversation, and very often that's really been a missing element when we discuss climate change and its impact in the northern hemisphere. Okay, it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Michael Dorsey. And if you could start with a brief introduction. I know we've had some of your bio and we've read it, and very impressive bio it is too. But if you could start with a short bio and then just go straight into the issue of the impact, what you think some of the main impacts are of climate change on the Global South. Thank you.
Yeah. Great. No, thank you all. Thanks for spending your evening, or your afternoon, or perhaps your morning to talk about these issues. I'm Michael Dorsey, and in the daytime, I'm an energy investor, also a member of the Club of Rome, and a co-founder of something that some of you perhaps have heard of, something called the Sunrise Movement, which is a political advocacy group based here in the US, but certainly collaborating with folks beyond these shores as well. So just taking a bit of time without the luxury of slide totalitarianism or PowerPoint totalitarianism, I want to speak about really not just climate justice in the Global South, but really what I think we can do and what we need to do for what I like to refer to as 21st century energy justice, which for me is the sine qua non of fighting climate injustice, fighting environmental racism, both in the global north and certainly in the global south. I think it's fair to say and perhaps assume that any group like this is well tuned in to the climate crisis. I think that is one of three key crises that we need to be mindful of when we think about climate injustice and environmental racism globally in the global south, and in municipalities, from sort of the small scale to the large scale, the climate crisis, as it were. And I don't want to spend much time on that because I think everyone here is probably tuned into this true existential crisis, the way in which we've exacerbated the unfolding climate crisis by not getting out ahead of it so far and doing so very quickly. So that crisis is one amongst a triple crisis. The other one, I think, is the problem of energy injustice. And that, I think, creates the third crisis, which is really the climate injustice. Energy injustice has many faces. I think it's best to say, and probably the most reduced way we could think of it in the short time that I have to chat with you to frame this, is that those on the margins of society, the poor, as it were, Black and brown folks around the world, they pay a disproportionate amount of their income, for energy. That's true in the global north as well as in the global south. And that other faces of the energy injustice problem, we see it in the siting of facilities. Just so happens that where we mine, for example, uranium for nuke plants and stuff, those are closer, those mines are closer to more marginalized communities. That's true in the global north and the global south. Where we cite dirty fossil fuel facilities, whether they be coal facilities, whether they be gas facilities, those happen to be more oftentimes in the backyards and neighborhoods of those that are on the margins of society, the poor of the society, Black and brown folks. This is true in the global north and global south. That's the second sort of pillar of the three big problems, as it were. And the third one is this problem of climate injustice. And it's unjust for a lot of reasons. The climate crisis is not playing out evenly around the globe. Those that are on the margins of society are harmed first and most by this. There's a whole, now we're coming into almost 2 generations of data about that problem. And it's been getting worse decade after decade, when really I would say that sort of early data was coming in probably in the 70s, late 60s, looking at those that are harmed from the unfolding climate crisis. They're certainly on the margins of society, but they're increasingly in the global south. We see catastrophic weather events harming those in the poorest countries and the poorest people within those countries. Those individuals are much more vulnerable to those catastrophic weather events. That's true certainly in the global south. It's also true in the north. The poorest of the poor in places like New Orleans in the US are harmed much more disproportionately than their wealthy counterparts in the same municipality. We've seen it in the global south, big cyclonic events on the east coast of Africa, impacting the poorest of the poor in places like Mozambique, and then even further inland in Zimbabwe, Zambia, harming those that are on the margins of those societies disproportionately more so than the wealthy in those countries. At the same time, we can look at a variety of climate-driven problems or climate-exacerbated problems, whether it be disease mortality, whether it be death and stress from heat. And we see that those problems, they play out and harm those on the margins of society much more so than they do those that are better off or the wealthy. So it's those three pillars: the climate crisis, the sustained and continuing crisis of energy injustice, and the unfolding climate injustice problem that I think are the sort of three crises that I want to sort of put in your mind. At the other side of that coin, as it were, I think there are 2 areas that we can begin to focus on to get out of these problems. The first for me, and is working, I'll say, on the money side of energy justice. Right now, we live in a world where, and this is a new world, this is a bona fide new world. It's only been a world that's been around for about the past 5, 6 years, not quite a decade yet, where the good stuff, clean, green, renewable energy, particularly wind and solar, PV and wind, are absolutely cheaper and more competitive, just in economic terms, not in the full cost accounting terms, but just in economic terms. They're more competitive and more financially beneficial than the fossil fuel, counterparts. I don't even want to call them counterparts, but then the fossil fuel foolishness that we saw dominate the 20th century. That's a new moment. That's something that I think it's fair to say that even those of us on the money side of the equation, doing renewable energy investments like I do, being involved in solar development like I have been and am still, didn't really foresee coming so fast. Many of us were arguing for it, making the case for it, that was coming, but really that's something that's come into play, really in less than the past decade. And that's true whether we look at the levelized cost of wind or the levelized cost of solar. Those prices for doing what's right, what makes sense, are now well within reach. I'll say why I flag that towards the end, but it's important to understand, particularly as we fight against dirty energy, as we fight against dirty fossil fuel projects that are still being stood up the world around, in the global south and the global north. I think the second sort of part of the solution is working for energy justice or climate justice, not on the money side per se, but on what I like to call the movement side. And this is something that we see happening around the world. Strong movements that are agitating for climate justice. I think I like to think of it as the fighting in the streets to keep those in the suites, the C-suites, the corporate suites accountable. And this is a formidable movement that's opening up space on the ground, that's agitating for that stuff that's clean and green, and it's going to make our lives better and healthy. And that's happening really worldwide. Movements are aligning themselves together, north and south, to fight dirty fossil fuel projects, 20th century relics, white elephants that are popping up still in the global south. Folks are working with folks in the global north, and vice versa, to deliver those changes and to hold governments accountable, as well as to keep up the pressure, that street heat, keeping up the pressure on those in the C-suites. So I think it's those two solutions, the solution of climate justice delivered by movements, social movements, as well as the bona fide empirical reality of the solution set penciling, as it were, making financial sense. Just in crude economic terms, it absolutely makes sense in full cost accounting terms. That is setting up an opportunity, I think, for agitation, for delivering us out of those three calamities that we confront: the climate crisis, the crisis of energy injustice, and the crisis of climate injustice. With little time left, I do want to set the frame that way, and then I think we can come back to some of the other points in discussion.
Thank you very much. Excellent timekeeping too. And I think your pillars create a very useful framework for us to further analyse those impacts. I now will invite our second speaker, Asad Rehman, to speak, and welcome.
Welcome. Thank you very much. And thank you for the kind invitation to join you this evening. My name is Asad Rehman. I'm the Director of War on Want. I'm sure some of you know us. If not, War on Want is it's probably seen as the most progressive sort of charity in the UK. We were set up to focus on the root causes of poverty, inequality, and injustice. It's through its very many decades of existence, it works directly with frontline communities, both in terms of workers and workers' rights, supporting frontline communities resisting extractivism, dirty energy, communities fighting for the food sovereignty and the right to food, and communities fighting, for the broader sort of human rights against the rise of authoritarianism that we're seeing. We also, of course, work directly here, building the movements, campaigning, amplifying the voices of the Global South. We've been very specific in terms of our interventions around climate justice, and we maybe we can talk about this a little bit later. We're involved in a project with movements from all around the world on what would actually a radical global Green New Deal look like that centered the realities of both the climate crisis, the existing crisis of economic inequality and neoliberalism, the reality of how the COVID pandemic is exposing the deep racial, economic and social inequalities, not just within our own societies here, but of course globally. And of course, situating that within a broader context of understanding of why and how the climate crisis is where it is, within the logic of this notion of the sacrifice zones and the idea of sacrificing the poorest Black and brown people, particularly in the Global South, for ultimately the profit motive and for the accumulation of profit. I'm reminded always, because Dorsey, my good friend, is here, of something that Greta Thunberg said when she was at the US Congress. She said, we need dreams, we cannot live without dreams, but there's a time and place for everything. And we're telling ourselves bedtime stories that soothe us and make us go back to sleep. And I think that has largely always been the call from the movements in the Global South. That in the global north, the reality of climate change and the discourse around climate change has been intended to, soothe over the actual realities and the impacts. And for millions of people in the Global South, the struggle around climate justice, has been one that connects the dots between the systemic exploitation that they see and their demands for climate justice. And one of the calls that they always make on to the movements in the global north is, tell the truth. Speak the truth to power. So obviously there's always a debate, whose truth are we talking about? And I think often the truth that we're told is a very, very different truth. I remember when I first started many years ago in the environmental movement, in the environmental justice movement, I was, when raising the inequities of the climate crisis, I used to be told, well, we're all on the Titanic together. This is a global problem and, we've hit the proverbial iceberg. And I always said, well, that might be true, but, overwhelmingly the citizens of the richest countries are still on the deck of the Titanics, still sipping cocktails, listening to the orchestra, and governments are hoping some technological miracle is going to rescue them. But it's the poorest people, indigenous communities and those on the front line who are in the hold of the Titanic and they're already drowning. And the great, of course, irony is when the people try and escape that, they find that the hold is locked shut. And I think it's a perfect analogy for the moment that we live in. So I don't need to tell you that the moment we live in is long gone past when you needed climate science to tell you about the impacts. Switch on your television screen any single day, you'll see the forest fires, killer droughts, floods, famines in every single corner of the world. And of course, whilst climate has no longer been sort of the focus on our television screens because of the corona pandemic, we've just got to remember we've broken the records each and every year, most violent storms, most powerful hurricanes, hottest temperature recorded. But these are not just about extreme weather impacts. So if you look at what actually is the consequence for people in the global south, you see the reality. When the one storm hit flattened Dominica, it wiped out development gains for a decade. It hit 224% of its GDP. When Mozambique, was hit with the cyclones, 1 million people were on the brink of starvation, not because of simply the cyclone, because of course over decades and a century, we had hollowed out Mozambique, both through colonial extraction and then more recently through resource extraction. So much so that Mozambique came to the City of London and was begging for debt-creating loans to deal with the impacts of the climate crisis. I could go on about, you know, India's 5th biggest city, Chennai, ran out of water last summer. Where I'm from, originally from Pakistan, we've had temperatures of 53 degrees centigrade. We have governments digging mass graves because they can no longer cope with the impacts, and of course the impacts on indigenous communities. And we all know the science, and we all know this figure. You know, we have to prevent the breach of the 1.5 degree guardrail because of what it will mean in terms of tipping points of more violent and extreme weather events, and what it will mean in terms of devastating the global economy and lives and livelihoods. And the cost, you know, I mean, the most conservative cost of the IPCC, you know, says, you know, the cost will be 70 trillion if we're at 2 degrees, hundreds of trillions if we're 3 degrees. And I think it's worth us bearing in mind 2 things. One, the trajectory we're currently on will at least lead to maybe 2.5 degrees, more likely 3 degrees, and even more. That's the trajectory we're currently on. And, you know, so the call of like the 1.5 is, many of us who champion that call, you know, was always 1.5 is not a safe level. It's just the one where most people in the global south will be able to struggle to stay alive, but they will stay alive as the consequence. Now, there's 2 things I just quickly want to touch on. Everybody's probably remembers the very famous champagne glass. You know, 50% of the poorest 50% of the world are only responsible for 10% of emissions. The richest 10% of the world, overwhelmingly in the global north, are responsible for 50% of emissions. And of course, it's an important story because that tells about the inequality and who's responsible and who's most impacted. But what's also very important is if you put the other champagne glass alongside it, the champagne glass of inequality, you see the same story, right? You see 10% of the world's population that owns over 50% of global wealth, and the poorest 50% only own 2% of wealth. And that matters because the reality of how this climate crisis impacts on the global south is about amplifying the existing inequalities. So when you have half the world, 3.5 billion people living on less than $5 a day, which hasn't changed since 1990, when you have 88% of the world facing some issues around poverty, and 3 billion people without access to electricity or clean cooking, 2 billion people going hungry, 1.6 billion people without adequate housing, and 1 billion people without water access, it forces us to answer the question that the climate crisis isn't simply about reducing carbon, it's about reducing inequality and injustice. And that is really, really important, because the answer isn't simply about a carbon action. It's actually about, you know, how do we ensure that people can live within, have a dignified life within ecological limits, within the planetary boundaries, and of course with respect to nature. Now, I want to say 2 very quick things about the UK, because often we hear at the moment this, so the UK is obviously hosting the COP26 next year and is boasting about its net zero 2050 target as being world leading. Let me just say, and I'll post this, you know, the War on Want, we did a study of what the UK's fair share of effort to 1.5 would be. If the UK was to do its fair share, the UK would be at 0 by 2030. Plus, it would have to hand over $1 trillion to the global south, simply a mitigation effort. That's not the cost of adaptation, not cost of loss and damage, because the rich countries have consumed so much of the existing carbon budget. And of the existing carbon budget that exists, if you take away all the, you know, sort of cross your fingers, hope something is going to miraculously save us, we're talking only about less than 10 years for 1.5, and even that at 66% chance. So that's 2/3 of chance that we're probably going to breach that. And many people are saying, of course, that we're looking very likely that we're fighting around the 2 degrees target, not only the 1 degree. Now, I want to also pay tribute to the movements, right, for climate justice movements in the global south, who've tried to always have this intersectional analysis and bring these things together. You know, in this summer, as the Black Lives Matter movement came to the streets and, you know, shone a spotlight onto racism both in the US and within our own societies, it began a conversation, and a long needed conversation, about the role of Britain and rich developed countries and how they became rich and developed, right? So we know, as Britain, you know, one of the reasons why Britain was able to industrialize was, of course, you know, slave traders in Britain amassed 8 billion in wealth from enslaving 1.5 million people of African descent. The flow of raw commodities that flowed from the Caribbean and from Africa and from the colonies were the engine of of Britain's industrialization. We could say, you know, slavery built every brick and mortar in this country. But it wasn't just about an historical fact, right? The Indian subcontinent, you know, when Britain went to India, you know, India's share of global GDP was about 24%. When it left, it was about 4%, and it had taken 45 trillion dollars out of India. That's, just to put it into context, that's about 17 times the entire GDP of the UK. Now, there's lots of studies which will say, you know,
can I ask you to quickly summarize?
I am going to summarize. That, you know, the question about this transformation that's needed, the scale of the transformation that's needed, you know, is absolutely huge, right? Because it has to answer now, not just the inequality question, the transformation of our food and energy systems, but it also has to deal with the realities of what's going to happen with, what's already happening with the corona pandemic. You know, 500,000 jobs have been lost in around the world. It's estimated that half of all jobs in the global south are at risk. We saw the reality. Yes, while governments in the global north intervened in their economies, however badly, to protect citizens and invest in public health, in the global south, that wasn't possible because countries just didn't have the resources to be able to do it. Now, if we see corona as a curtain raiser to climate change and its impacts, it shows us two things. It didn't show a global response. It showed rich countries competing with poorer countries for access to health equipment. It saw poorer countries being left alone. And that is the story of also of the climate crisis. But it doesn't have to be a story of misery. There actually has to be a story which is, I think, really important for all of us, which is how do we talk about a vision of the future, an economy of the future, which is able to connect the fight around social justice, economic justice, climate justice, and racial justice. That's our challenge, and I think it's one that we can actually meet.
Thank you very much, Asad. That's a lot of passion and energy there, and I think that's what's needed. And I think one of the things that you've both managed to do is to not just talk about climate change in isolation or the impact of climate justice in isolation, but to link it to very important aspects of human life, livelihood, you know, daily life, poverty, and also having a voice. And I think those things are very important. I think now we are going to turn to questions. Is it time for questions or? Okay. I'm not quite sure where the questions are posted, Peter.
They're in the chat, and you'll find the first 7 questions, the first items in the chat.
Right.
And I suggest if those people are here, because some of them aren't there, ask them to put their questions.
Okay.
Greg will help you on this if, because he's more awake than I am.
Okay, Greg, have you got the list of questions?
No, I don't have them because I joined the meeting late, so I don't have the whole.
Okay. Well,
has anyone got a burning question that they'd like to ask quickly while I look for the questions? Is there a burning?
There was one that I did answer in the chat, and so I'll just repeat it to tee us up. So someone asked, you know, rather insightfully, I think, you know, who is still investing in fossil fuel projects? And the rejoinder to us, I thought the markets now recognize the danger posed by climate change, and institutions were starting to divest from dirty energy. So capitalism doesn't really recognize the dangers of much, now does it? So that's why it's a problematic system that we've got to get really beyond. So there's a great number of fossil fuel projects coming up, you know, and I gave some links in my answer. So just in China alone, and I suspect they may not be able to build all of this, but they've got teed up about 120 plus gigawatts of coal-fired power alone. That's more than all of the planet's coal-fired power, you know, and that's under construction. So they're building that. They may not get there the whole way because the prices are going against them. But that's just on the coal side. There's a great report that I gave you the link to in the chat. Folks can download it, that talks about gas-fired power that's coming online. So fossil fuel projects continue. They continue apace. What's I think the challenge for those of us on a call like this, and those of us concerned and fully tuned into the realities of the unfolding climate crisis, pardon me, is the way in which these projects are bona fide white elephant projects. They don't make economic sense. They've never made sense in the full cost accounting terms, in terms of the impacts, the deleterious impacts on health and human lives. And that's a real thing now, and even more so in as much as they don't make economic sense, but they're actually happening. So, but other questions, please.
Thank you very much, Michael. So I think Katerina Silveira, are you there? Are you with us? Would you like to ask your question? Katerina from Brazil? What about Rosilla? Is Rosilla with us? From Kenya. Okay.
Yes, I'm here.
Would you like to ask your question?
Thank you for the presentations. Probably my question will be, what are your thoughts, any presenter can respond to this. What are your thoughts on being keen also on the need to influence policies by governments pertaining to climate change, mitigations and adaptations, so that when this is done, there's need to also link this with principles of climate justice, because I tend to feel that some of these mitigations and adaptations do not link with the climate justice principles, because there are some climate justice principles like transparency, inclusion, and all that. I don't know what your thoughts are, particularly if this will be injected to be part of the activism around protection of the environment to be considered. Thank you.
Can I ask Asad, would you like to take that first, and then we'll go back to Michael with that question? Okay.
Sure. In a my previous role, I used to work at Friends of the Earth, and I spent over a decade at the UNFCCC, the climate negotiations. And I remember a time when the word justice was only used by very few of us, and that, you know, the narrative around climate was purely seen in technical terms, in, you know, parts per million or in carbon. And what climate justice brings is the lens about both people and planet to that question. And I think it's absolutely right and important for us to push those principles. Now, increasingly within our movement, I think there is more of an understanding and acceptance that the frame of justice is critical, both to build the social license that we need for the transformation, but also to ensure that actually the climate solutions that we put forward don't further deepen in existing inequalities and don't leave other environmental injustice or impacts behind them. Now, are government policies and even most policies doing that? Of course not. But that's partly, I think, our challenge as movements, to shape and influence both the narrative and discourse, but also to pressure the policymakers to ensure that the policy solutions that people put forward to these crises are ones that are actually ones that are rooted in the realities and the demands of people in the global south. For far too long, and we've seen this, we've seen wasted decades where people have looked to market solutions, the very system that produces the climate crisis, to then try and solve the climate crisis. And it's why, you know, we're now faced with a decade where previously we had 40 years to be able to slowly transition away from a fossil fuel economy. We're now faced with a much more urgency and demand, and that's why climate justice is really critical to it.
Thank you very much. Michael,
Sure. No, I would, you know, simply co-sign with what Asad has just said. I think we've got bona fide and amazing social movements all over the world in the global south. I just put the link in the chat for you, Rosilla, to PACJA, which is the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. You know, it's more than 1,000 groups across all of sub-Saharan Africa, in not quite every country in Africa, but almost 50 of them. So they've been doing a tremendous amount of work over decades now and counting. You know, they've got their main office, the secretariat is in Kenya, in Nairobi. So there's a whole, I would say, a large sea of social movements that are not just trying and working and fighting, you know, derelict and corrupt governments north and south, but also doing that to hold the polluters accountable too, and to reverse this tide of fossil foolishness from the fossil fuel sector, and then also deliver the changes that governments need to put in place, whether that is in terms of making more space for solar and wind, which is still lagging, even though it's it's something that makes economic and financial sense. Whether that's also putting rules and stiffer regulations on polluters that are still putting out lots of poisons from fossil fuels. So that social movement is doing that in many regards, as well as uplifting the voices of people, and kind of like I was saying, basically turning that street heat, the heat in the streets in social movements, and holding those in those suites accountable.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your question, Rosilla, and I hope that addressed some of the issues that you raised in your question. Greg, do we have an additional list of questions? Or?
Other than the questions that was submitted, I think that I don't think anyone else who submitted the questions in this call. Okay, so
should I go to that first and then come back to you? Is that okay? There is Harris Grove Harris, United States.
No, they're not on the call.
Okay, what about Samantha Sutton? No, okay, that's fine. So do we have some questions?
Yeah, the next question was from Sue.
Okay.
So if you want to unmute.
Hi, yeah, it was really great to hear some of the links that were being made by both the speakers to the anti-racist movement and Black Lives Matter and the climate movement. And I just wanted to ask a question really about, we heard especially from Asad about some of the movements in the global south that are happening, the social movements. But what sort of scope do you think there is for us here in the north, especially I'm thinking in Britain, to really make common cause and to link up the anti-racist movement and Black Lives Matter within it with the climate movement for climate justice in this country? Because it seems to me that the huge injustice, between the north and the global south is quite evident. I mean, people being forced out of their homes, losing their livelihoods, becoming climate refugees, etc. But sometimes it's a little bit more hidden in this country, but I think it's still really stark. I mean, Black, brown and other ethnic minority peoples are very often concentrated in much less energy efficient housing, in areas where the air quality is much worse. All those kind of inequalities that we can talk about between north and south also happen within countries within the north. And I think that there's traditionally not been much of a link made in this country between the anti-racist movement and the climate movement. And I wonder if you can just sort of say a little bit about what scope you think there is for us here and in the States to really try to change that and look at ways that we can work together.
I think if we go to Michael first with that one. So Asad's unmuted. Okay, would you like to go ahead?
Okay, do you want me to go first, Sonia?
Yes, okay, you're unmuted, that's fine. Michael, I'll come back to you. Apologies.
Okay. I think it's an excellent question, Sue, and I suppose we could have a whole session on it, and I spent many years on this very issue, right, about how to reframe climate so that it connects with the anti-racist movement, that it centers that racial inequality as a reality, as economic inequality. Now, I think there are some positive signs. I mean, I think one of the positive signs, and Michael can talk about this from a US perspective as well, is when you look at some of the people who are out on the streets in their protests about Black Lives Matter, and then you look 6 months ago or a year ago, they were the young people who were out also on the climate strikers. They're the people who are leading the Fridays for the Future, people who are understanding the connections between the issues. And that, I think we're beginning to see a generation which sees how these issues are connected and have a broader justice frame. Now, we here in the UK have a huge responsibility. Next year, we as the UK host the COP26 in November. The UK is also hosting the G7 meeting it's an opportunity for us, both in the UK, to connect the realities. If we look at, for example, COVID, and we say it's exposed all the deep racial, economic, and social inequalities that exist in that country, and many of them are environmental issues. It's you know, your life, the mortality, and the health impacts are as much about poor housing. It's about air pollution and air quality. It's all of the social. They're the very solutions that the climate crisis or climate justice movements have an answer to. It's warm homes, it's public transport, it's actually also tackling energy poverty, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's an opportunity, I think, for the climate movement to go beyond its bubble and connect with racial and social justice movements. As the COP26 coalition, so please do all join the COP26 coalition, that explicitly has done something very different to what normal climate coalitions have done. Most climate coalitions, when they've been formed, have been, to be honest, largely the big green NGOs. And this one has explicitly from the beginning said, we are going to be an inclusive movement that reaches out to migrant and racial justice, economic and social justice, and the trade union movement right from its beginning. And all of those groups have come together. So what we want in November next year is not simply empty calls on our government to act. We actually want real concrete political demands that we can build power around. That means when the UK talks about its green stimulus, or it talks about the recovery, we're very, very clear what kind of recovery we want. We don't want a recovery built on more extraction of resources from the global south, and we don't want a recovery that continues to expose the inequalities and delivers inequalities in this country. The same when we make demands around climate justice, we don't want to simply say, governments act. We want to be very, very specific. We don't just say 100% renewable energy. We talk about decentralized renewable energy systems, so it tackles energy poverty. We recognize the material use that is coming from the expansion of electric batteries and what the environmental injustices that will mean. So it leads us into a much more profound conversation, like what kind of economy we want, what kind of society we want. And there is an opportunity, I think, an appetite, because people have seen it during the corona pandemic. People have recognized what are things that are most important: community, public services, health, all of those. And I think our ability to be able to weave that story together, I think is the one that is going to be the success or the failure of this next 18 months in terms of our movement and connecting both the Black Lives Matter and climate justice narratives together.
Thank you very much for that, Asad. Michael?
Yeah, I would certainly endorse all of that. The one thing, a couple of things I would add to it is that the one upside, both on our two sides of the Atlantic, as it were, is that your DEFRA does actually have a definition of environmental inequality, and I put it in the chat. That's important, certainly for legal accountability and holding them accountable, that the agency has sort of put this in writing. And so that's something that, and correspondingly on our side here, the US EPA does have a definition for environmental inequality. Actually, they have an office in the EPA of environmental injustice. Now, at the same time, these agencies are beleaguered in many ways, as we know, and they need to be constantly held accountable, challenged, and pushed. And I think, so that's just at the broadest level. I think one of the key things, though, and just to sort of take what Asad is saying just a little bit further, is that the reality is as I was saying now, it's a new thing that fossil fuels are no longer cost competitive with renewables. And increasingly, renewables are not just becoming, not only are they now competitive, they're becoming increasingly more and more competitive. So that's, certainly in the main, it's a great thing. That's going to see the explosion that we're seeing in renewables, in particularly in PV and solar. Coming soon, right behind it is going to be storage and so forth. And then in the reconfiguration of the grid and delivering energy as we know it is going to follow right behind that. The reality, though, of that changing terrain of prices and that the good stuff is now more competitive means that we, as those concerned about rights, those concerned about justice, are going to have to keep pressure on those monopoly capitalists to not act like monopolists and not usurp that which is due to the people. And so that's going to be just as much of a struggle as it was dealing with these fossil fuel characters. The fact is that an energy monopolist wants to be a monopolist whether he or she is playing with coal, gas, or solar. And so when you understand those challenges, we've got to put some guardrails. And I'll take off my solar developer hat. There are projects that I've been involved in where you've had returns, in the, greater than, 2 or 3 times greater than venture returns, 30, 40% IRR. Now, when I go into a utility, I can't say, oh, that's too much money that you're giving me. But we as citizens concerned about rights, we've got to begin to put gates on those that are profiteering in what's clean and green, because that's going on. And there's ways of maneuvering around this. So when we talk about a Green New Deal, we've got to have certain rules, social rules, that are going to be in step with protecting rights, protecting those on the margins, and not seeing monopolists take the huge windfalls and passing little or nothing off to those that are on the margins of society. And that's really the political space and the political terrain, because we can certainly easily have solar oligarchs. This is a thing that can happen, and if we don't fight back against it, we'll have it. And you can have wind oligarchs as well. So that's something that we have to keep in mind.
Thank you very much, Michael. I believe that Carl Barrow has a question. Is it Carl next?
Oh, Sonia's Linda next.
Ah, Linda. Sorry, I didn't see Linda. Sorry, Linda.
Yeah, no worries.
Nobody's mentioned nuclear power, and I'm hoping that Dr. Dorsey sees nuclear power as almost as great a part of the problem as fossil fuels, but it'd be good to know what he says. And secondly, it seems that the Black Lives Movement and climate campaigners are beginning to work together, and that's brilliant. But one aspect that always seems to be left out is peace and anti-militarism. And we can't heal the problems of the planet whilst we're spending trillions of dollars on weapons and bombing countries in the poorest parts of the world. And we need to really divert those resources into tackling climate problems and climate injustice. And it would be really good to try and raise the level of thinking about this within the climate justice movement. Thank you.
So I couldn't agree more. No more ridiculously expensive way to boil water than I've ever seen in my life, a nuclear power plant. Nothing to really waste time on there. The reality is, and some great news studies on this, I'll put them in the chat after I stop talking, but great news studies that the stuff doesn't pencil, the cost overruns, let alone the social movement unrest to stop it from being built in the first place. It's not going to deliver it. It hasn't delivered. It won't deliver. That's as much as needs to be said about it. And I put 2 sets of things in the chat. One where I've said this in many papers, and you can Google my name about this. I'm readily out there in the public on this. And then I put some things, some of the latest studies, the past few weeks actually, that make the case that really nuclear has nothing to do with basically renewables. Wind and solar are coming online much faster, don't have those cost overruns, certainly don't represent the sort of the other existential threats that nuclear does represent, and we've seen meted out from Chernobyl to Fukushima and points in between.
So I won't disagree. I mean, I totally agree with Michael on nuclear. I think through every lens you look at nuclear is not the answer. Even if you are willing to accept all of the other risks associated with it, just that the timescale doesn't allow us to do nuclear, we'd be fought, as Michael set out in his presentation. The answer in the future is going to be renewable energy, right? It's not wasting billions and billions on nuclear energy. I think you actually make a very, very important, Linda, a point about militarization. And again, it's part of what we've been trying to do is say, when you look at, for example, the question about, how do you finance this transition, the scale of the transition that's needed, the support that's needed all around the world. People often say, well, it's just too much money. Well, one thing we've learned during the corona pandemic, there's no shortage of money when governments want to spend money. And as they've been spending money in terms of the bailouts that they're being given to big corporations. But of course, there's huge amount of money that we're spending in terms of the arms trade and arms sales. So there's that one question. But also, I think for climate people, whilst we talk about climate justice and we talk about the vision, there is another conversation going on. And that conversation is not just of the far right, but actually of mainstream governments who say The reality is we are going to breach 2 degrees. The reality is we are going to see collapses in food. Reality is we're going to see displacement of people. You've seen the studies about 1 in 30 people could be forcibly displaced from their homes. And they say that the answer to that is going to be securitization, is militarization. It's going to be the need for more walls and fences. And of course, we've seen that mantra increasing all around the world. It's not just with Donald Trump and his war and his call for build a wall. If you look, 20 years ago, the Pentagon had a discussion about what were the likely impacts of the climate crisis and how should the US government respond. And it's one of its key findings was we're going to see a wave of unwanted migrants from the Caribbean, from Latin America, and from Mexico. And the answer is going to be, we need more border measures. We need border fences. We need an increase in the budget of our border defenses. And lo and behold, within 20 years, the budget had tripled, and now we see the reality. We see the same happening with the European Union. We see the same happening even with countries like India. The mantra is walls and fences are going to be the answer. Now, for a problem of the global commons, where we are not willing to allow citizens, our sisters and brothers in any part of the world to suffer, we have to counter that. So, and the militarization, I think, is going to be a very central part of the story that we tell, saying that's not, because it runs so counter to the vision of solidarity that is needed if we want to have this kind of transition of our societies and communities.
Thank you very much for that, Asad. That's yes. The next person I think is Carl Barrow. Question, Carl?
Question, thank you. Question to Dr. Dorsey. I think that Botswana has recently announced its intention to start exploiting its vast coal reserves. So how do we help countries in the global south, like Botswana, avoid being forced into exploiting their fossil fuel resources, and just help them leapfrog direct to the kind of technologies that you've been talking about, Michael, the new renewable technologies that are essential to raise their population's living standards?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 tendencies in Botswana, and this is one that's near to me because we're working on a small solar installation there, a megawatt project there, which is on a farm. So I think, a lot of the world, the global south certainly included, is already engaged internally in this kind of struggle between bad energy and what we really need. So the folks that are doing this 1 megawatt, they actually they have an alignment with some UK investors, to make it clear on that point. So there is a space in the sort of bilateral relationships for supporting efforts on the ground. Some of that leapfrogging is already happening. I think we need to sort of talk about it more. Folks on the ground in their countries, Botswana is no exception to this. This group it's a Botswana group, but they've got some friendly folks from the UK involved. They are sort of striking out on their own because the government utility, Botswana Power Corporation, BPC, has been sort of lagging on solar. They've had 3 past solar RFP windows, requests for proposals, that they opened up and then subsequently decided not to go ahead with the Botswana Power Corporation. So there's a real battle going on. It's not a sort of a unipolar or a lopsided battle of where only fossil fuels are surging in the global south. So simply knowing that there's a battle going on, I think is half the struggle. Working with groups that are supporting those on the ground, both in those struggles politically, but also to the extent that some may have the resources to do so, I think is another tranche in that struggle. And then additionally, it's really important to, I think, hold our multilateral infrastructure, but in the sort of country to country, the bilateral apparatus, together. Whether that's the development agencies, whether that's making them, many of whom are giving nice statements about their beginning to walk away from fossil fuels, but we've still got to keep the pressure on them in our own countries, and that has an upside that the funding for those bad projects isn't there. But at the same time, as we want to block that kind of funding, we want to encourage
Were we losing Michael?
Yeah, it's breaking up a bit. But
Oh, did I cut out? Sorry.
Back with us? Are you? We missed the last few sentences of what you said, Michael. Do you care to repeat them, please?
Sorry. Yeah. No, I was simply saying that. Can you hear me okay now? Is it?
Yes,
good?
I can hear you.
Good. I was in that we've got to not just block our bilateral aid agencies from funding bad projects, fossil fuel projects, but we've also simultaneously got to encourage them to fund clean and green and renewable energy projects, because the fact is that just as much as they put too much money into fossils, they haven't yet begun to ramp up the investments into green things. So that's a double pressure that we've got to apply. So it's that basket of strategies.
Thank you very much. Asad, would you like to?
Sure. So, I mean, it's a really important question, and it's one that, having worked with many countries in the global south, is a real challenge, right? Even for progressive governments, move countries where majority of their citizens are without the basic necessities, pressure governments and say, we want access to energy, we want housing and education, we want those necessities that give us. And governments are trapped into the, like, what do we exploit? How can we deliver those? And some of you might remember it was well over a decade ago, 2007, when Ecuador, said, with the Yasuni project, said, we have 1 billion tons of barrels of oil under the ground here. We're willing not to exploit that oil. If governments of the global north, rich countries, will help us with some climate finance so we can transition our economy, invest in green energy, do all of those things. They wanted about $3.5 billion, which was a tiny drop in the ocean compared to how much they would have made from exploiting the oil. They got 200 million and they had to abandon that project. And that's the story increasingly for poorer and poorer countries who are stuck with this choice of like, what do you do when you have actually no support? And that brings us to a really big question about what is it we do? So first of all, the reality of climate finance, there was a figure that was plucked out of thin air in Copenhagen that climate finance, $100 billion would be provided each and every year to the global south by 2030. It's never been matched. You may have seen a report today from Oxfam which shows that something like 80% of all the climate finance that's gone to the countries in the global south has gone in the form of loans, more debt creating loans for countries who are already crushed by sovereign debt payments. And we saw that reality during the corona pandemic, right, where Ecuador had the dead were lying unburied in the streets, and Ecuador was paying debt repayments to bankers, and bankers were applauding that and saying that's a good government, yes, that's great. And we see that reality now as something like 46 countries are on the brink of in a debt crisis where they don't have access to any intensive care provision for their citizens. Now, in that, what is our answer? Now, I think there's something, if bringing it back to the moment we're in, one thing we can call for is that the green technologies should be patent free, that intellectual property rights on technologies which are to safeguard the planet and people should be available to all. Now, you'd think that was going to be something that would be, everybody would accept and say, absolutely, it's for all of our safeguard and all our well-being. We can see with the vaccine, the corona vaccine, right? Countries in the global south are saying, will this vaccine be made available to everybody in the world? And we see pharmaceutical companies saying, no, that it'll be lifted on a patent. It will mean that the reality is in the global south in 2024 might very well have access to a vaccine, that the global north with 13% of the population globally has already bought 50% of all available vaccines, even though the vaccines haven't been tested. It's already amassed that. So we have to fight for intellectual property rights to be lifted, for patents to be lifted. We also have to fight here in the UK, where the UK is signing trade agreements, that in the trade agreements, they put in provisions, ISDS provisions, which are basically this investor state dispute settlement clauses which allow corporations to sue governments if governments take action which threaten their profit. And fossil fuel companies are threatening governments in the global south and taking them to court if they move away from fossil fuel extraction or they ban fossil fuel extraction. So if we want to provide alternatives for poorer countries, one thing we've got to do is we've got to make sure we're providing climate finance in real grants. We've got to make sure our trade rules don't embolden the fossil fuel industry. We have to recognize the crisis, the financial crisis that much of the global south is already in. And if we want to really see this transition, it can't be simply an empty call, do 100% renewables. We have to give them the means of implementation behind it.
Thank you very much, Asad. So we've got about four more questions that I can see. Time's against us. So I'm going to ask the questioners to be very brief with their questions, and also for our two speakers to, if it's possible, be as brief as you can with the answers. But I totally understand that it's not something that you can say in a few minutes. There's a lot of passion. It's urgent. The urgency is also there as well. But I'm in the interest of hopefully having all the questions addressed. Thank you. Our next question comes from Esther. Esther Mururi, are you there? And apologies if I've mispronounced your name. Esther.
Yeah, yes, I am here. Good evening, and you've done well with my name. So I think partly listening to the discussion, the question has been answered. But my question, there's another part I would like to ask the speakers. Do you feel that the pressure that is currently being put by the climate justice movement, do you think those in power are listening? And what are the best practices from the global south on climate adaptation and climate mitigation that we can use to put pressure on the developed countries to take action?
Okay, Asad, do you want to quickly address that, please?
Sorry, my signal dropped a bit then, so I didn't catch all of it then. Could you just quickly repeat the thing, or if Michael answers it, then I'll remember.
It was in and out for me as well, so I love the repeat of it as well.
Esther, do you want to pop back in and repeat your question quickly?
Yeah, am I clear now?
Yes.
Yeah, my question is, what are some of the best practices in the global south that can be used to put more pressure in the global north to take action on climate change? And do you think the movement, the pressure the movement is currently putting on authorities, do you think those in power are listening?
Thank you, Esther. Asad?
Yep, sure. I think, often we talk about what are the solutions to this climate crisis. The reality is the solutions have long been known and are being practiced in the global south. There's much that we have to learn from every one of those solutions. If we want to look at how do we protect our nature and our ecology, what we can see the best practices are in the global south from indigenous movements. If we want to talk about, for example, now when we look at the crisis around food and hunger, we know that the solution is agroecology. It's practiced by the global south. 80% of the world's population is fed by 24% of land by small farmers. It's our consumption, it's the industrial food system of the north which is leading to the deforestation. So I think there's a lot of solutions that are there in the global south and are part of the demands that we can learn from. And that also is a bigger one. Now, recently, in this last few months, people have started to ask this question, should our economy be measured only in GDP, or should we be started talking about well-being and, an economy that values other things? Well, those are principles that have been long argued and fought for in the global south. And they were in constitutions before governments were overthrown during the 70s and 80s, that the idea of the economy was to serve its people and to safeguard their well-being. Are governments listening to us? That for me is a fundamental question, always about power. Do they have more power than we have? And how do we amass more power? There are cracks opening, because just before the corona pandemic, if you remember, we were all watching the screens in Chile as millions of people came out on the streets, connecting environmental justice, labor rights, human rights, feminist movements, saying this is not about if you remember the slogan, this is not about the 30 pesos, it's about 30 years. And talking about wanting a change to their economy, to their constitution. They were talking about inequality. We saw those scale of protests happening all over. So I think there is anger building. The question is, are we going to be the ones with the solutions and direct that into the right way? Or is it going to be the far right who capitalize on that anger by saying to people, you know, what this transition is going to make you lose what little you have. It's fear or it's hope, and it's our job to make sure that we build a movement around hope.
So to that, I would just briefly add that there's a tremendous amount of north-south activity, but also south-south activity that we have got to, never, I think, underestimate nor overestimate, for that matter. We've seen some similarly problematic, neoliberal commitments, capitalist market commitments along the south-south trajectory. We've got the BRICS Bank, which is a south-south, sort of neoliberal project. So that's driven lots of these unsustainable projects. At the same time, there's been tremendous amount of cooperation in the south-south trajectory, as well as a list of things that just what Asad just mentioned in terms of what we can learn from what's going on in the south. So I would say that there's a sort of a complicated sea that we have to sort of pay attention to, not underestimate.
So we've got now Chris Ring. Are you ready with your question?
Yeah. Thanks. This is really primary to Michael, but I think you've sort of partially answered it, Michael. My question relates to the question of how we can prevent the returns from the development of clean energy generation in the global south from ending up in the hands of profit-seeking elites, either in that country or outside it. You mentioned the value of guardrails attached to investment. And I was wondering, it does occur to me that those guardrails maybe need to be internationally agreed, and they need to be supported by all the countries who are vulnerable to exploitation if they aren't in place.
I would indeed see, in the future, that kind of, call it a, renewable energy agreement or multilateral renewable energy accord, where you would have some framework or a framework, multilateral renewable energy agreement, where you'd have some rules and terms, because the reality is that we now are in the world where, the Green New Deal, the financial aspect of it, the fiscal aspect of it is quite real. There is the capacity for the returns for renewables, the cost of which, my costs are constantly falling. We were doing a project in Zimbabwe about 20 months ago, and there was some delays in the project, small project, but we had to go back and report to the bank about the falling, our cost changes, which were going down, which would mean the bank would have to put in less money. We did that out of a courtesy, so we could be seen as a good partner in this because we want to do more projects. But there's no obligation to do those sorts of things. There's no one legally binding me as a developer to do that at all. So right now we're in a mode of a kind of almost, I think there's a parallel between the sort of the oil robber barons of the late 19th century and early 20th century, akin to the renewable robber barons of the current moment. And there are not as many rules at all. So I think we could be in a moment where we need to see more of that, and much more so, because if we want to move those resources, look, I don't need, 40% return. It's outrageous. Could 10 or 20 points be shaved off and still, there'd be lots on the table? Absolutely. But where those resources go, that's something that has to be sort of fought out in the political space. Should it go to schools? Should it go to hospitals? Even where we have robust or more robust systems of sort of public, safety and medicine and everything, they still could use fortifying. So do we allocate there? Do we allocate otherwise? So those are conversations that we have to have. We're not having them, so much.
Okay, thank you. Unless you've got anything pressing to add to that, Asad, are you happy for me to move to the next question? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I would just add one thing. I think there is a, you know, Michael's right in terms of all of the regulation, what we need to do. But I think there is a bigger question, which might be what Chris is also touches on. With food and energy, do we need to move to a moment where we say energy and food is a public good, that you enshrine it into law, that people have access to energy? And then you're able to start from the point, you know, of how do we meet that? So we're not just talking about generation or distribution, we're actually talking about the control of energy, and how do we make the decisions about how much energy is being produced, for what is energy being produced? Because we've got this dilemma, right? We need to reduce about 60% the amount of energy use we've got in the world. We've got a 60% increase in the number of people in energy demand, and we've got to make it more efficient, and we've got to do renewables, whilst also recognizing that our material use at the moment, a sustainable, let's say 50 billion, is about 80 now. It's going to go to about 150 billion tons of materials. So the answer isn't just to take more materials. The only way you do that, I think, is thinking about it in a very, very different way, energy, like we do about services, public services. It's something that should be shared and controlled by us collectively as citizens.
Thank you very much. So Jamie did have a question, but I believe he's no longer on the call. If you are Jamie and want to ask quickly, but Nesta Jarvel's the last final question. And then if we keep our responses and the question brief, so that we have time for summing up and hopefully some actions and reflections. Thank you. Nesta rather.
Hello, I had actually two questions. This is fantastic what you've all been talking about, but is there an actual plan as to how we're going to go about it? And also in the north, I think the first thing needs to be making rules for new builds, so that they integrate renewable heating and renewable energy. And are you doing anything about that, and what can we do about it? Did you hear all that?
Would you like to go? Oh.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a crack at that. Thank you, Nesta. I think there's maybe two parts of the question. So the first part, in terms of how we're doing that, well, we're working with, as I said, with movements to try and what would a radical global Green New Deal look like. Arundhati Roy has this very lovely saying where she says, you know, the problem with the world is, you know, we have to undo like 1,000 threads of it to create the world that we want. And often I think we're all overwhelmed, like, where do you start? You know, it used to be a slogan of the anti-globalization movement, didn't it, right? One no, many yeses. And often I feel like we've got so many yeses, we get lost to which yes should we fight for. So this part of this is trying to say, what are the transformational fights that if you win them, deliver us solutions in a number of different areas? And if you could do that, change the parameters of the discussion and what's possible. So I put in the link if you want to sign up. We're trying to do that and have that very much as looking towards the COP26 for next year. I think the second part of your question in terms of around planning regulations, warm homes, etc. I'm no expert, but I would say, you know, the one thing that I think every climate person should have on their wall is the picture of the Gilets jaunes, right? The yellow vests in France, in their protests, when they protested the carbon tax. And they had a banner, the first banner, it said, the elites worry about the end of the world. We ordinary people, we worry about the end of the month. And I think unless we start to answer that question, what about people who worry about the end of the month? It leads us then to start fighting for things like, yes, it is about warm homes. Yes, it is about retrofitting people's homes. Yes, it is about then recognizing what are the interventions we need to make. And I think somebody already posted there about, you know, the attack that the UK government is about to do on ripping up even our weakened planning regulations to allow, you know, developers to be able to develop. We need more regulation, not less regulation. We need government to enshrine the climate and the imperative of the 1.5, but also to tackle inequality at the same time. If you do that, I think you then come to the right solution.
Thank you, Asad. Thank you, Michael.
So no better way than to say that, look, in the end of the day, just like Cornel West is fond of saying, justice is what love looks like in public. And so we've got to fight for it and stand for it. And I think some of this is getting on to what I like to think of as we need to begin rehearsing the future. And that's delivering on many of these things. And that's why I'll end it, because we're at time. So.
Thank you so much. Are there any final words that either of you would like to say in terms of actions, or what we all need to be doing, what we, how we make connections between the global south and the global north, to strengthen the movement? Any final words?
I would just say one final word. I first thank you for all of you for giving up your evening, and I know many of you are doing the most amazing work locally. I think our challenge is, of course, the local to the global, and that we can only do, I think, if instead of thinking about our local work separate from our global work, we connect those. So when we're fighting for like warm homes in our communities, we're also making the call that people should have homes all around the world, where we're talking about, whether it's public services, so that it doesn't become or, it becomes and I think that is the way that you connect our issues at a local level towards a global level. But there is a window of huge opportunity for us, and I look forward to being part of the struggle with many of you, and I know many of you already are, to that vision, as Michael said, of not just hope, but of love and justice.
Thank you. Michael, the final words.
Thank you all very much, for taking this evening, and I'm looking forward to collaborating and conspiring and working with everybody. And it was a wonderful chance to meet some new friends and see some old faces as well. And now we should let Asad go back to football.
Thank you so much from me. It's been wonderful. It's been a learning curve, and it certainly spurred me on, given me some new ideas. And I'm sure that everybody will join us in, saying thank you so much for giving up your time. Thank you so much for all attending. And I'm going to pass on to Peter now, who's going to say a few words before we end. Thank you all. It's been absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. You passed on to me. Yes, this is really boring compared to the discussion that's happened, which is fantastically rich. And we need to try to enrich all our activities by always thinking about this dimension. And there's a lot of hope when we think about the strategies and the solutions. However, I just want to go through a few minor organizational announcements. And firstly, there's a meeting on plastics. This is Derbyshire. There's a meeting on plastics tomorrow night. Greg might want to remind us about that, but perhaps you could put something up in the chat. We will be distributing the chat and the recordings if the technology is working. There's also a meeting on November the 3rd for all the Derbyshire groups to come together to report what's happening. I'll be putting out announcements about that. It's also a very interesting meeting on November the 7th. This is low scale in terms of what we've been talking about. It's about air source heat pumps, but there's a real pressure in terms of our carbon emissions, in terms of gas, and a number of people are talking about air source heat pumps, what they're doing, what the practical solutions are. We also have, I'll add all the people who are not on the Derbyshire email list. I'll add you to that. But people from outside, I won't add you to that, but let us know if you want to be added to the War on Want list. And then the last thing is we have an internal discussion group. If you want to be part of that, just email us and I'll send you the details. We have about 100 people on it, and that's one way of discussing the issues from tonight. So on those boring, I don't want to end on a boring thing, so I just want to end with a big thank you to all of you, especially our speakers, especially to Felix, but above all, especially to all of you, and really above all, especially to you from other parts of the world, because we are part of the same world. And thank you very much.